Hey, and welcome to the Get Fit with Jodelle show. I am Jodelle as always, and I am super excited to have such a established and well published person with me today. I'm excited to share with you Dr. Olle Johansson, and I think I pronounced it right because my last name used to be Johansson, so it's neat to talk to someone with the same last name that I used to have. So if I am pronouncing it incorrectly, let me know. How did I sound?
No, you sounded perfect,
Okay.
It was actually very, very good. And because many people, they do get it wrong. And of course, I will get other people's names wrong as well. So it's very hard to move across country borders, isn't it? From a language point of view.
Yes. Well, I love your last name because that's what I used to have too. So, Dr. Johansson is a neuroscientist at the world-renowned Karolinska Institute. He is the leading authority in the field of EMF radiation and health effects, so I'm super excited to talk to you about this. He has published more than 650 original articles, reviews, book chapters, and conference reports within the field of neuroscience, dermatoscience, and health effects of electromagnetic field, within the health effects of electromagnetic fields. And you're also, I understand, you were the head of the Experimental Dermatology Unit at the Institute? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Oh, great.
And since November 15 last year, I am retired. But funny enough, I would say I work more than before, So I fill my days with endless, very important, very interesting, very rewarding reflections sent to me by people all around the world. And I'm just so very sorry that my time is limited. I wish I had at least 100 more hours per day and night. Because many questions, I just cannot deal with. It's too much, and I feel sorry for it. But at the same time, being a scientist, all these emails pouring in like an avalanche, they are kind of a thermometer, telling me that, Jesus, the interest and the need out in the world is enormous, actually, and it's growing by the minute.
Yes, and you have been doing this kind of research, which is why I really wanted to talk to you before anybody else really got to the market, basically, or to the lab to start doing this. I mean, you were under what I consider one of the first people I've found to really dig into EMFs and how they affect the body, specifically with regard to the skin. So I'm excited to talk to you about that. So what kind of got you into that field? Can you tell us what kind of led you to that?
Yes, I did something one evening at 8 o'clock, which I generally never do, actually, and it's very odd and funny from that point of view. And now we are back somewhere around the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. I listened to the radio. There was a radio program on, and I was just about to turn it off, actually, when I caught some words, because there was a woman, her name is Kajsa Vedin, and she works within the trade unions here in Sweden, or at least used to do it, and she was asking for expertise in the field of neurology, and I'm not a clinical neurologist, but I'm a neuroscientist. So I thought, well, close enough. And she was talking about something I had been pondering for quite some time, actually, namely all the modern man-made artificial electromagnetic fields. Could they have adverse health effects? And she had found mostly women, because women at that time were the first to really use at workplaces computers and computer screens. They were just introduced in Sweden, the personal computers, at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s. And she had found women and a few men that had got some skin irritation, skin rashes, palpitations, pricking pain, heat sensation, and she was just curious because it looked very much as a classical sunburn effect, but it was in the middle of the Swedish winter, and I could tell you there is hardly ever any sun out there, and they were working indoors, and the only source of radiation was the newly introduced computers and computer screens. And she, of course, asked herself, could they be the culprit? Could they be the gadgets that were causing these cutaneous health effects? And then I decided, this evening, not to turn the radio off, but to continue and listen. And it was very rewarding. She was highly intelligent. And I realized that out there, and I had read about a few cases. Actually, the first cases came from United States and from Norway, but quickly followed by, for instance, Sweden and other countries. But I hadn't realized that they were so many. And so, to make a long story short, the day after I called her, and she invited me to meet her and a physicist from Göteborg. They were both working in Göteborg on the Swedish west coast. And actually, they took the train and came to me at the Karolinska Institute. And that's the reason why I talk to you today.
Well, I can tell you have a passion for it, especially because, like you mentioned, congratulations on your retirement, but it seems like you're still working and you still believe passionately in helping us understand the dangers of EMFs. And so I really want to ask you to sound some alarms with regard to my listeners understanding the adverse health effects and the downright dangers with constantly exposing ourselves to higher and higher levels of device radiation, whether it's tablets or smartphones or computers, but even just EMFs in general. And let's start by just helping my listeners understand, where do electromagnetic fields come from? Are there good ones and are there bad ones? And what should we look out for?
Oh, that's a very good question, of course, there are electromagnetic fields that are good in the sense that you can use them for instance, medical purposes. You can use power frequent magnetic fields to increase the healing rate of a bone fracture. You can use X-rays to examine your organs. You can use gamma radiation to burn away tumors, etc. But of course, that's a very specialized and focused use, and for a very, very short time, generally speaking. But everyday exposures nowadays, somewhere in the order of 70-75%, comes from wireless gadgets. You mentioned, for instance, smartphones. You have the Internet of Things. All the things should communicate in between. You have radar devices on your car, and so on, And the levels that are allowed for public exposure, you can compare them with the natural background which is present in that frequency range. And then, and this is a sort of classical introduction to a lecture, I usually start to ask the audience how much more, and I only pick out one gadget, namely the third generation cell phones, how much more 3G radiation do you receive onto your body and into it today as compared to for 25, 30 years ago. And people, they sit there, they ponder, they say, well, it's probably twice as much, and someone would say 3 times as much. And I remember one time there was an elderly gentleman who spoke out and said, no, it's a lot more. It's 100 times more. And the entire audience, they turned to him and said, no, there's not a possibility. That's too much, But actually the answer to that question is that the increase compared to the natural background is in the order of 1 quintillion times more. That's a 1 with 18 zeros, and then more.
Oh my gosh.
But yeah, it's just, it's even for scientists very, very hard to grasp and understand that kind of increase.
Well, it is, but at the same time it isn't, because if you think of our typical day and the exposures we're getting that are non-native, then like I've heard it said, native is like the radiation from the earth, the natural electromagnetic fields from each of our bodies and things like that.
Yeah.
If you think of the typical day, the first thing that people do when they get out of bed is they turn on their cell phone, or if it's already on right next to their head, they've been radiating themselves all night long. Then Yeah, then they turn on the TV and watch the news. They've got that radiation. Then they get in their car with their Wi-Fi hotspot in the car. Plus, they have Wi-Fi in the house while they are getting ready for work. So in the car, they have their Wi-Fi. They have their Bluetooth in the car. They're driving to work. They get to work. They're surrounded by probably lots of Wi-Fis because multiple businesses usually have many routers and things like that, and they're in front of a computer. And then the cycle continues as they go home and into the evening. So I think if we really think about it, it's not that big of a wow, but yet at the same time, it's like people don't think about it. They don't think about it because they don't feel it until it's too late, right?
No, it's, as you say, don't feel it until it's too late, and it's invisible, and people don't even understand. I remember when I was at the hematological center, a very big one here in Sweden, and we were doing some experiments regarding blood cells, and then the head nurse, being the chief of the entire department at her nurse level, she was asking us what we were measuring actually, and we said that we were measuring radiation, and she said, well, there is no radiation here. Oh yes, I said, there are a lot of base stations and routers and so on, they're hidden somewhere in the ceiling. She looked very awkwardly at me and shook her head and said, "No, there is no radiation here." And yes, it is, And then I saw she had a cell phone in her pocket, and I pointed to it and said, "Well, your cell phone, it works via microwave communication." And then she brought it out, looked at it, and said, "Actually, I always wondered how they work." She had not understood what was going on, but from that moment she understood, and later on when I met her, some months later on, she said that she had quit using it altogether.
Fantastic. You made a breakthrough with her, huh?
Yeah, I mean, that wasn't the purpose, but she was so sort of shocked by the revelation, how it worked, at what levels, and what it could do to various cell types.
Well, and that's what I want you to bring to the table today is I think people just think that it's this magic little device that's either on your lap or in your pocket that doesn't have any implications, because I don't know how it works, but it works, and I'm invested in it, so I don't want to know the bad implications, but they need to know, because adverse health effects are coming up with these things all the time. And I know that you even coined the term screen dermatitis, to where I mean, we can talk about how it actually affects the skin. So would you enlighten us about how EMFs affect the skin?
Yes, we can start there, because then we are again back at the early 1980s, and when we took skin biopsies from facial skin, from office workers having worked in front of the newly introduced personal computers, having got skin problems, skin irritations. To make a very long story short, it turned out that cellular alterations and also molecular alterations were exactly the same as you would find, for instance, if you expose yourself to X-rays or to classical alpha, beta, and gamma radiation from isotopes. But we haven't exposed people to that, of course. They had only been sitting in front of the safe in-person computer screens, but actually they were not that safe, because after a few hours they got the same changes at the cellular level as you would have got from, for instance, radioactive isotopes within seconds or minutes for X-rays. And it included a whole variety of different cell types, like dendritic cell types, mast cells, and so on. And they all looked exactly as a textbook example of a classical radiation damage. Unfortunately, at the same time, physicians, oddly enough, physicians that had never met a person with this skin damage, they had never talked with anyone, and they had no experience, but still these physicians knew, within quotation marks, that these women and men, they were only a subject to imagination. There was nothing real behind this. There was nothing wrong with the computers. And of course, they also introduced that the real culprit, it was actually people like you. And that's what is called a mass media-driven psychosis. When people listen to or read about a phenomenon, they start to think, well, I probably have the same. But all of these counter remarks can easily be scientifically investigated by just changing from human beings to rats. You know, rats, they don't listen to podcasts, they don't read newspapers, they don't watch television, and still, when we subjected them to the same type of radiation, they got exactly the same changes in their skin, in their thyroid gland, and so on, you know. So, of course, it was real, but society wasn't prepared to listen. So there was a very strong opposition, and it actually grew more and more and more. And still the opposition is quite strong. I just read today in a Swedish report that there was no cause for alarm regarding these new gadgets, particularly the 5G that is coming around the corner.
Which we're definitely going to touch on that too.
Yeah. And it's just ridiculous because we don't know very much about 5G to begin with. And that we know about 4G, 3G, 2G, and 1G makes us all believe within the scientific field that you should be very, very cautious about this.
Oh, for sure. And I totally agree that there is this vested interest that people have with these devices that they don't want to hear. They'd rather just hear about nutrition, and they'd rather hear about exercise for health reasons. But don't tell me to stop using my cell phone or my tablet or watching Netflix because I love it, you know. And yeah. I've actually lost patrons on my Patreon page because I've been posting so much about 5G and the coming technology that people need to be aware of. So I'm trying to help people, but yet they don't want to hear it. They're like, I'm not going to be your patron anymore because I don't want to hear you talk about this.
Oh, that's really a pity, I would say, thing. Because, you know, some people have actually, and now I'm talking about extremely powerful people, they have listened to people like you and to me for decades. Okay. And I could just introduce quickly, you have in United States and England and other Anglo-Saxon countries, a very good saying or remark, and I quote, "When in doubt, always follow the money." And that's very interesting because, for instance, the World Health Organization, the radiation protection authorities around the world, the manufacturers of telecom technique, the operators of the same, and above all the insurance and reassurance companies already more than 15 years ago completely abandoned this safe ship. And then you should remember that, for instance, insurance companies, they insure more or less anything. They have a very short no-no list, or they call it the blacklist. But on it, you have health effects of electromagnetic fields. Absolutely. So they believe in you, they believe in me, and they are completely open about it. I was at a meeting in 2002 in London, and for instance, representatives of Lloyd's UK, Reassurance, which is the largest reassurance company in the world in Switzerland, If Scandia from Sweden and so on, they all said in unison, for them, it was not the question whether there were health effects or not. The question was only who is going to pay for them in the future, and they will not do it. So that's more telling than any scientific paper I could quote, you know, and it gives a very straight message to the population. And of course, people don't know this, they don't understand it. And in Sweden, though, there has been a multitude of newspaper articles, for instance, in the daily newspapers the last 15 years about it, but people, as you say, they are so occupied with their phones, so they cannot read any longer, you know, and they don't understand, they don't really see where it's going. But we are pretty alone on this ship nowadays. All the major players have abandoned it.
Yeah, and it's just really unfortunate because there is so many different ailments that I believe are coming from all of this chronic technology use and all this, you walk in any building and it's got Wi-Fi. I mean, I was in the airport the other day and every single person sitting at the gate, except for me, was on a device. Every single person was, no one was talking. Everybody was looking down. I know everybody's seen this when they fly. You look around and people don't talk anymore. When I used to fly, you used to sit down at your gate waiting for your plane and you go, hey, where are you going? What are you doing? And you talk to each other because you didn't have anything else to do. But now we've got this whole world in front of us that, and as you can see, I have mine on airplane mode because I don't want the radiation. But we have this whole world in front of us that we can contact anybody anytime, but yet it's meaningless. It's kind of like I'm bored, so I'm just going to check my Facebook feed, or and it's we've lost. I put out a podcast recently about we've lost our village. We're not taking care of the immediate people around us because we're connected to this worldwide village that can't really help us when the chips are down. So
exactly. That's
what I wanted to bring up too is, like you had talked about, you noticed this screen dermatitis in the 80s, and how different, or is it better or worse, the computer screens we're exposed to now versus when they first came out in the 70s and the 80s? Like, should we be even more concerned now, or is it actually better technology now?
Well, since we are not allowed to really investigate this, I cannot give you a detailed answer, but technically some of this radiation has been lowered in some frequency domains, but at the same time it has been increased in other frequency domains. And when I listen to people nowadays that use computer screens, I get kind of three different answers. Some say they are worse, some say they are better, and some say there is no change compared to the 80s, and no difference. And so one would really want to investigate it in detail. And in the meantime, as you said before, we are constantly flooded with newer and newer and newer gadgets and more and more and more irradiation, hoping that it is safe. A hope that we don't share with the insurance companies and not with the manufacturers and so on.
So can you tell me some examples of if somebody was really, they have these skin issues going on and they're not sure what's going on. They think it's a food allergy, or they think it's some sort of sensitivity to some lotions they're using. What would they look for that actually could tell them that this is actually from your screen usage?
Oh, that's a very interesting point you bring up, because as you say, nowadays, like in Sweden, I very often meet people that have skin irritations, and they are localized, like to the face, the upper portion of their chest skin, their hands and arms, and they try them to take away various types of exposures, like from food and from soap and from clothes and whatever, and they still have it. And then I asked them, how about your wireless gadgets? Could they be causing these things in some way? And they always say no. That sort of ends of the story. And some of them actually, after having said that, they will go home and still start thinking, still start pondering, could it be? And just by avoiding using it for some time, you can see if it gets better or not. And one should not, of course, rule out the possibility of, for instance, food sensitivities or other types of irritations, but one has to have an open mind here.
Okay, so here's the kind of something that I've been wondering, because I kind of am a conspiracy theorist, so I watch some of these things about 5G and about cell phone usage and how people are kind of out to get us with cell phone usage, which I'm not really sure about that. I don't think it's like weapons of mass destruction or anything. I'm not sure about that. But, I think it was John Biden who died from a tumor to his head, and a cancerous tumor, and they showed a picture, and it actually looked like his cell phone. And according to the webinar I was watching, he was a big heavy cell phone user. He was using his cell phone quite a bit. Do you think there's any validity to that?
I would say that there is definitely validity to both issues. Now you're talking about cancer, but you started to talk about kind of surveillance tools and so on. And of course, all wireless gadgets are interconnected in such a way so anyone knows anything about you. As long as you use it, you will be monitored, uh, hopefully only for commercial reasons, to send you the right ads for your interest and so on. But of course, it's extremely easy to also monitor a lot of other things, and it has turned out to be a brilliant tool to solve crime, because you can then afterwards view what people have been sending to each other before they committed crime and so on.
Right.
But at the same time, the question is, of course, when will, for instance, your political awareness become a crime in a future state? And do we even want to consider the possibility of being monitored or not? That's a very big area of discussion. Regarding cancer, it's much clearer in the sense that cancer, and particularly brain tumors, has been on the table for quite some time. And again, people don't understand or know that the World Health Organization in Geneva, they cancer classified so-called power-frequent magnetic fields, which are very strong from a cell phone or a tablet, for instance, and its association to childhood leukemia. And that was already 2001. 10 years afterwards, 2011, they also cancer classified all types of radiofrequency fields and their association with brain tumors.
Wow.
And when I give lectures, and particularly to parents and teachers in schools, I often start by asking them if they would allow the children to sit in a school room filled with welding smoke or petrol and diesel fumes, or formalin exhausts, or DDT, or lead exposure, and all parents and teachers, they just go, no, of course not, what are you talking about? And then I say, well, actually you do, because all these exposures have been cancer classified by the World Health Organization in the same category 2B as radiofrequency electromagnetic fields. From your cell phone, from your tablet, or from the children's tablets and cell phones.
Well, and the increase in cancer, you can't deny the increase in cancer with the increase in usage of devices. I mean, there's got to be a correlation with that.
Well, at least according to the World Health Organization, they have cancer classified this. And it's interesting because, again, as I say, if someone would try to force you as a parent to put your child in a room filled with welding smoke, you would, of course, protest.
Right.
But no one, as a parent or teacher, protests against the radio frequency electromagnetic fields from the cell phone until they hear a lecture by me, for instance. Then they often get really very angry. I say even pissed, sorry for the English. No. They get really, really angry because they think their authorities, their parliaments, their governments should have informed them about this decision. And they haven't.
Well, and it's unfair that we've been told that it is safe, and so I try to tell people, it's not your fault that you've gotten so used to this device. We were basically told, here's your cell phone. No, here's your upgraded cell phone. Here's a couple years later, you got to get this cell phone. It's all safe. Don't worry about it. You won't, and you don't feel anything. So it's hard to say for sure that it's doing something until it's too late. And I love one of your published articles called "Malignant Melanoma, Not a Sunshine Story." So, I mean, maybe we can shift into that now that we're talking about cancer, because it's not a sunshine story, is it? It's not about sunshine.
No. Of course, malignant melanomas, of course, are dependent on, for instance, sunshine radiation. No question about it. But as a teacher at the Karolinska Institute, I had been standing in front of students who should become medical doctors, and I had told them that the increase in Sweden of malignant melanomas, which is a dramatic increase actually, that was due to the fact that people in Sweden, they got more money, they could afford to travel to the Mediterranean area like the Canary Islands, Mallorca, Spain, and so on. And then they were exposed to too much sunshine, and they got the malignant melanomas years afterwards. And that was the truth I had been told, and I lectured about it. But then I started to think, and together with my collaborator Örjan Hallberg, who unfortunately died some years ago, we started to think very hard. And I said, from medical statistics, I have been taught that you should always plot your data, meaning that you should make a graph over all the cases. And so we did, and to make a long story short, it turned out in plain English that from the graphs we did with melanoma cases, actually you first died, then you got malignant melanoma, and then from a time point of view, you went to the Mediterranean. So it was completely the other way around. Okay. And then we said, oh, this is just a coincidence. We must check other countries. And we checked like Denmark, Finland, Norway, United States, England, blah, 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 all of them, and it was the same all over. And we could also see that, for instance, in Sweden, the increase in incidence and also something called prevalence-based mortality, it started around 1955. And 1955 in Sweden, you had the introduction of FM radio, frequency modulated radio, which everyone loves because there you have all the fun radio channels. Right. And then we said again, this must be a coincidence. So we went to like the Baltic states and checked there, and they had an introduction of FM radio around 1992. And guess what? The increase in malignant melanoma in these countries started 1992. And we continued doing these studies in further and further detail, meaning eventually that we got a very good overview image, and it was fair to sit down and pinpoint in further publications that actually maybe FM radio fields could be one of the culprits behind the dramatic increase in malignant melanomas. And the reason could also be that these FM fields, they are what is called body resonant. They fit very nicely with the length of a man or woman. And everyone knows that because in the old days, when we had what we call in Sweden a transistor radio, if you grab the antenna, then the reception of the program became very much better. Because you are a better antenna than the antenna the radio came with. So you will sort of suck energy into your body. And if you suck energy, it's like blowing on a fire. It will increase. And we thought that any tumor progression that you have in your body, being exposed to more and more energy, more and more fire, of course it will grow. Of course you will get further melanoma cases. And as I said, we have never been able to prove ourselves wrong, and we would be happy, of course, if someone would, but it seems to be a very important culprit to also investigate.
Well, and that just, I had a flashback to my childhood, because now I'm thinking, my dad used to make me hold the antenna in the living room on top of the TV, the little rabbit ears that came out. He's like, hold it, and it'll just stand there and hold it so I can watch this football game, because he would get better reception if I sit there
when I was a kid. My father and also my elderly brother told me to do the same, and no one thought about
family. We
could
have
this
the same
be bad for you? No, I was happy to be able to help,
Yeah. Well, and then I'm thinking, okay, that's a funny note, but on a sad note, okay, now we're carrying around these in our pocket, and we're still conductive, just as we were then. And as you said in the beginning of the podcast, they use EMF to help with bone regeneration and different internal ailments, which means it can penetrate deep into the crevices of our body. So it doesn't just have to be surface skin layer. Now we're talking internal damage from being a conductive resource that this phone is attached to that's coming from a local cell phone tower, correct?
Yeah. No, this is also a very important avenue you enter now, because in the beginning of the 1990s, it was very often said in Sweden that the penetration capacity of the modern cell phone systems were only like microns or millimeters in depth. Mm-hmm. And then I'm a scientist, and being a scientist, I love all the very simple experiments that you can read about. For instance, when we talk about Nobel Prizes, often the Nobel Prizes are extremely simple. It's just a matter of the right man or woman at the right point in time and at the right locality to really see what is there, And what I did, I said to myself, strange. This must mean if the penetration is so very bad, as the telecom operators and the radiation protection board say, then we should shield the signals, and it should be hard to even use a cell phone. So I took, I think the correct word is plump, two plump ladies, voluptuous, big, fat, I don't know what you say in English.
No, plump is good, yes. That's a much nicer term.
Yeah, they pressed a cell phone in between themselves, and then they really hugged for all of their power, They hugged each other and pressed it. So it was completely invisible. Mm-hmm. And then I tried to call the phone, and it immediately responded. It was as if the ladies were not even there, So the penetration is not microns or millimeters or centimeters. It's right through the entire body immediately, Oh. And that, of course, ended all the counter arguments from the industry and so on, that the penetration was so very short, but it's not.
Well, so, and then you have children using the devices too. Yeah, then you have children using the devices too, which are much smaller units. So Can you talk about how it might affect them on even a greater scale because they're more concentrated?
Well, I mean, you have already said it, and they are smaller, their skin and their bone structures and so on are thinner, etc. But maybe the effect is the same on a child and a grown-up, but from a societal point of view, for instance, if I would die tonight from a brain tumor, there's not a problem for society. But if all the children starts to get damaged while they are 7, 8, 9 years of age, then we don't have a society soon.
Well,
so the impact on children is so much more important, and therefore I have struggled for years and years and decades to really try to wake up people and try to get them to take their responsibility, if not for themselves as adults, at least for the children, the teenagers, and for the newly borns and the fetuses. And for the sperm cells and egg cells, the coming generations.
Sure.
And unfortunately, I must say, mostly I talk to deaf ears, but sometimes I hit home and people do react. But of course, it's a very steep uphill to get authorities, governments, parliaments to do anything really.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, this whole body experiment goes on day and night.
Yeah, so it's really up to us to mitigate what we can, because like you said, the governments, parliaments are not really doing anything to help mitigate this. So it's really up to us. So in just a minute, I want to ask you, like, what are some of your top recommendations that people can do to start limiting their exposure to this chronic radiation? But there's something else I wanted to ask you. I'm reading a book right now called Going Somewhere by Andrew Marino.
Yeah.
And have you read that book?
I haven't, but he is a fantastic scientist,
Yeah, and in the book, he talks about he did a study with rats that, with a cage full of rats that had EMF exposure, and then the control group that had none. And within, I think it was 6 weeks' time or something, the rats with EMF had gotten bigger, and something else was wrong with them. The scientists discovered that all of them had glaucoma. And
Yeah.
so he did end up repeating that test and didn't get the same results. But at the same time, it really started getting me thinking, because a lot of what I talk about in my podcast has to do with eye health too and immune function. And I wanted to ask you, since we know it affects the skin and even deep layers of the body, how does this chronic exposure to screens affect the eyes? Have you looked into that?
I haven't done very much on it, but as you say, Andrew Marini has, and also there is another study, and right now I don't remember the names of the authors, but I could find it for you after this interview. And what they did, they looked at uveal melanomas, that is malignant melanomas in the bottom of the eye, and it has increased because of the radiation, is their conclusion. And I always think about, that people nowadays, they expose themselves to this in colossal levels of electromagnetic fields.
Right.
And as you say, straight into their head, their ear, but also straight into their eyes. And also the constant illumination from the screen. I must say I'm questioning it. Is it really only good for you? And of course, you know that, and I'm sorry I don't have the correct English words here, but for instance, near-sightedness, myopia, has increased dramatically in children because they look at all these gadgets at a very short distance. Right. They get deformation of their posture. They look like vultures, nacke we say in Sweden, because they are bent over these gadgets all the time. And of course they sit too much, they don't exercise, and nowadays in Sweden, even commercial companies come forward in TV ads and say, hey, drop that phone for a minute and do something else.
Right.
Because the general health of the population is deteriorating rapidly. And now in this interview, we have only talked about one single species, namely humans. Don't forget, the impact on animals, on plants, and what really keeps me awake in night is the impact on bacteria. 2017, Tahiri and co-workers published a study where they had irradiated bacteria, including like Listeria and E. coli bacteria, to the radiation from cell phones and from wireless internet routers. And to make a long story short again, it turned out that nothing really happened with the bacteria, apart from one small thing, which is not so small actually. They became antibiotic resistant.
Oh my goodness.
And last year, 2017, the G20 countries had a special meeting in Europe only about antibiotic resistance, because in 2017 it was calculated that more than 25,000 Europeans will die prematurely because of this, and it was said that in 2050 it will be more than 10 million people worldwide dying from antibiotic resistance. And then you have to remember that G20 meeting did not at all take into account effects shown by Tahiri and co-worker, because that was published afterwards. So maybe the 10 millions will be 7.3 billions.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I had no idea about the bacteria connection yet.
Yeah,
you just opened my eyes to a whole new world.
Publication, and I could tell you, when I read it, I thought for a second, no, they must have done something wrong. Although I knew that I had for decades actually warned people that don't only look at human beings or experimental rats or whatever, also check out like plants, bacteria, etc. Yeah. And suddenly you had this publication, and I immediately called a relative who is, she's a surgeon in bones and arms, orthopedic surgeon, yes, sorry. Orthopedic. She's an orthopedic surgeon. And I called her at a big hospital here in Sweden, and I asked her, tell me, I said, is this antibiotic resistance thing we are reading about in tabloids and so on, is it really a problem? And she sighed and said, oh, it's more than a problem, it's a dramatic problem. We are kind of losing the handle on this shuffle, and we need to do something quickly. Otherwise, people will start dying from a splinter in the thumb and so on.
Unbelievable.
Yeah.
And then you just made me think of something else. So recently I saw, because you mentioned a hospital, recently I've noticed 5 different hospitals in my area that have now cell phone towers on the top of them. Not necessarily the towers, but the cell phone emitting the mobile base station devices, the long, skinny things at the top. And I'm thinking, okay, not only are now people inside a hospital surrounded by radiating machines and things like that, and everybody's smartphone and Wi-Fi throughout the hospital, but now we've got these cell phone connecting towers on top of hospitals.
Yeah,
and so
it's the same in Sweden too, hospitals, universities, and similar structures are often used to place base stations on. It's exactly the same here, and through reflection between different wall structures, as you say, the patients, the staff, the relatives inside the hospital will be even more irradiated than if they were outdoors. So it's a very strange situation, and particularly when you, as you already have, and as I have read all the scientific papers showing very dramatic effects, and nowadays, we calculate that there are at least 25,000 publications clearly showing that you should not allow yourself, your children, your dog, your goldfish, your tomato plant, and your bacteria to be irradiated by these types of man-made fields.
Well, that's okay. I've got a squirrel brain today because I'm like bouncing around because you give me so many ideas. Okay, everybody I've talked to this year also said that they've had really poor gardening season. Like, I wonder if the plants are affected by, there are cell phone towers going up everywhere. And there's more Wi-Fi than ever before in this coming 5G technology. I have a client that's up in the New England part of the States, and his grounds are areas for testing 5G, and he's having so many health implications that I believe have nothing to do with food. It has everything to do with what he's being exposed to that he has no idea about. And so I want us to touch a little bit on what you know about 5G and what we need to watch out for, basically.
Well, as I said before, for 5G, there's very little still done, but you can easily compare with previous research. And just touching upon plants, we have ourselves, for instance, irradiated cress seeds, and they didn't germinate very well, they didn't grow very well when they were irradiated. And also the very, very famous publication from 2008 in the journal Planta by Alain Vion and his co-workers, where they exposed tomato plants from the type of base station fields that you have, pretty low radiation, and they saw some very dramatic effects. And when Alain Vion was interviewed in the radio, he said in his typical sort of French English that when they looked in the microscopes on the cells of the tomato plants, they looked as they had been crushed by a hammer. And they hadn't even touched the tomato plants. It was an extremely well-controlled study. And when you crush a tomato plant, or if you cut your lawn, the grass, they will respond with a damage sequence containing, for instance, molecules such as calmodulin. And that was exactly what these tomato plants, only having been exposed to the safe radiation from cell phone base stations, also showed. So while we are talking, maybe everything is kind of at jeopardy.
Oh, I totally believe it. I mean, you can kind of see, if people will open their eyes and see and count how many cell phone towers, which I want to remind people that they're also called base stations. So if you want to do your own research and look on things like PubMed and read the studies, type in mobile phone base stations. And that's how you're going to get more research. Because if you just type in cell phone tower, you don't get a lot. But I mean, if you just count your drive from home to work, how many cell phone towers you see, it's phenomenal. I mean, it's nasty, in my opinion. In fact, I've got a whole document of published studies that I want to take to our town hall meeting and say, can we not allow any more in without everybody in the community signing off who's in a quarter-mile radius of it, because it will affect them health-wise. Even though I know there's a law that protects against that, but I wanted to put it out there anyway, because if people are aware of how it affects their health, then maybe, just maybe, they'll say, okay, yeah, we need to also be able to sign a petition to not allow this mobile phone base station in our vicinity, because we do know there's health implications. So, yeah,
and also I would say that
people just need to become aware of.
And do not only remove the cell towers and the base stations, be sure also that you actually remove the microwave irradiation, because very often, operators will say that, well, okay, we move this tower away, this antenna, but they just move it away like a kilometer and then upgrade it so it gets much stronger, and the functional levels where you were originally are still the same. You haven't won anything. So it's very important to make sure that the actual irradiation is stopped and gone.
Yeah. And so to that effect, let's talk about some things that people can start doing now, because there are things that we can do. We can still live in this world, even though, as we've talked about, it is getting more and more dangerous as far as radiation. But there are things we can do. And what are some things that you try to implement, knowing the amount of knowledge that you have as regard to EMF? What do you do and what do you recommend?
Well, I mean, to begin with, I would definitely say that people should listen to persons like you. You can get a lot of information from which you can start thinking, reading more, reading more, and so on. Yeah. So that's a very good start. And to familiarize yourself and get the information and start digging through some of the scientific publications. Absolutely. But also always remember, as I said before, that all the major players, they have completely abandoned ship. Few people know, for instance, that when you buy a cell phone or a tablet, in the instruction manual, which is up there in this invisible cloud nowadays, it says very clearly that you have to keep this gadget at least 1 inch away from your body. Mm-hmm. People read head, but it says actually body, and that means practically and from a law point of view that you can never, ever touch it.
Yeah,
because that have violated the information you have got.
Yeah, I mean, that right there is...
At least 1 inch away from your body.
Yeah, that right there tells us that we're overexposing ourselves by even having a cell phone. But, but since we live in a world where...
To answer your question, you can always try to use cabled systems, a cable telephone, a cable computer, a cable tablet, or you can go one step further, and people will now scream out, I mean, I have never ever owned a cell phone. And the reason for that has nothing to do with what we are talking now, because when they were introduced in Sweden in the beginning of the 1980s, they were very big. You needed to be strong to carry them around. You had a big bag over your shoulder. They were very expensive, 30, 40, 50,000 Swedish crowns, compared to today where you get one for free actually. Right. And there were only very important people using them. And then when I saw this, I realized that I'm a kind of weak man. I cannot carry such a block of technical equipment. I'm not rich. I cannot afford it. But most importantly, I am completely unimportant now and then. So I don't need it.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
I don't think that I actually miss anything. I don't need to update my profile on the Facebook because I don't have one. I don't need some pictures of my cakes and my dog and whatever because I don't have the Instagram or whatever it's called, Yeah. And if I want to meet someone, I will go down to the train station instead of checking Tinder.
Yeah, so why can't we do that still? Why can't we actually go out and meet people? Yeah. Because people are out there, so it's just a matter of making yourself available. If you go out
Yeah,
from behind the
yeah,
screen, what I call green time versus screen time, go outside,
yeah.
like
No,
meet
I
people
love you
out of
say
doors.
that because, I'm a very keen, and I want to stress the word amateur gardener. I love to be out in the garden and looking at all the plants and the insects and birds and so on. And I don't want to sort of see them through an electronic gadget like a
Yeah.
cell phone or computer screen.
Mm-hmm.
They don't get better by that.
Yeah. Well,
So,
in practical terms, since I know there are a lot of people watching who do have Facebook, and maybe they just have it to keep in touch with their family who are, miles away, and that way they can
of
see
course.
the kids
Yeah, of
grow and
course.
things like that. Because I know, technology does have its bonuses, and then it definitely has its detriments. But in practical terms, like environmentally, what can we do? I mean, a lot of
Well,
times I will tell
yeah,
my clients, turn off the
yeah.
Wi-Fi in your house when you're not using it. Turn your phone on airplane mode when you're not using it, which I know my husband hates because he can barely get a hold of me. But at the same time, it's like you can do these one less, have one less device, one less something emitting radiation. And so what are some other things you recommend?
Well, I would also recommend, because you probably won't like what I'm saying now, to turn things off and put them in airplane mode and so on. That may not help very much at the
Okay.
bitter end.
Okay.
Maybe it's better to put an consumer power strength on issues such as calling or writing to your local political representative,
Yeah.
to healthcare officers, to medical units, and demand change.
Okay.
Be very strong about what you want to. And I very, very, very often meet people who want to have a change, but they have a hard time to really express it. And I think you should try to cook it down to one sentence, and it should be short.
Yeah.
If you don't want to be irradiated, then you should tell everyone around yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And also to inform yourself, as we said before, of course, if you can turn it off, uh, do it. But it may be kind of a false safety. It's a little bit like saying, I will only drink alcohol on Fridays, and then you drink a lot.
Yeah.
So I couldn't really support that. But of course, do whatever you can.
Yeah.
But it's very important to put pressure now and to put blunt questions. Why should we expose something to ourselves that insurance companies don't want to protect us from?
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the golden question right there. And
Yeah.
I appreciate what you said, because even if for some reason we don't think we'll make a difference going to like our Senate or whatever, we can do it like what I'm doing, like going to my town hall meeting and saying, okay, I'm going to start local. I'm going to do what I can right here and tell my town, let's not allow any more cell phone towers in this town. Let's designate a safe zone where there are no cell phone towers that are going to be put up. Let's get Wi-Fi out of our local school district and just get all the kids tethered to something with Ethernet versus just Wi-Fi throughout the school. Things like that. If parents or people would do that, I think they can make more of a local impression, even more so than on a grand scale. And then hopefully it will branch out and more people will become aware, and then it will become a grand scale.
Yeah. And also, now we enter a completely other field, actually. If we talk about schools, there is an idea that electronic gadgets will improve the quality of learning. But for instance, the OECD, this gigantic organization, have done gigantic investigations into this issue, and they came to the conclusion that the only thing that could change learning quality is a dedicated and well-paid teacher. Electronic gadgets didn't make any difference whatsoever. You have to remember things like that, And I think many of these systems and gadgets have been sold because we have a society based on commercialism, on greed, profit, etc. We shouldn't forget that. And finally, when I was many years ago at a meeting at the European Union, I found out that the European Union is actually only really afraid of one entity, namely its citizens. And they didn't listen, for instance, to the citizens in the United Kingdom, and now they have the Brexit on their throat, you know. So you can make a huge difference just by being the naughty citizen, demanding change, demanding real safety, and always also when you ask questions, do not allow any evasive answers. The question you put should only be possible to answer with a yes, no, or a figure, or the word I don't know.
Okay.
And people refuse to answer, come back again, come back again, come back. It's like playing with children, you know. You need to repeat yourself.
Yes.
Did you actually take the cookie? No. Well, I ask again, you know. And that's the way to do it. And I promise you, you can make such a huge difference. And you don't need to be very many. Don't forget, for instance, the world famous author Rachel Carson with her book Silent Spring, you know. From the beginning, there were not very many persons that shared her interests and ideas. But nowadays, we have the whole environmental discussion thanks to that.
Wow. Yeah, that's a really good point. I love that you shared that. So thank you. And then another thing that you made me think about was with regard to the schools is you mentioned that you speak in schools sometimes. Have you been able to make a dent by speaking in schools? Because that's something I think I would like to do at some point. You know, I'm no neuroscientist, but I'm passionate about getting Wi-Fi out of the schools. And I will say that the article that I did write about green time versus screen time, the research study I looked up said that children are now better at swiping than they are holding a pencil at a young age. And so swiping has become, you know, just more mainstream than holding a pencil. And there's just something really wrong about that.
But, you know, I could answer you as a scientist because there are a number of studies, and I think in particular one where they subjected boys in a double-blind exposure experiment to cell phone radiation while they were taking a linguistic test. And when they were exposed, they did the test less well. Wow. So they were, as we would say in Sweden, dumbed down. Wow. And the question is that really what we want to do to our kids? Of course not. Right. Oh, and the same has been shown in animal experiments by the foremost expert here, really. You have it at your own doorstep, namely Henry Lai at the University of Washington in Seattle, who used rats in a maze study. And when they were exposed for as short time as 45 minutes and at exposure levels that children are supposed to withstand, the animals that were trying to find a piece of food in this maze did less well. Oh, it has been shown over and over again, you know.
Yeah. And what do you think about, like, getting in nature after you've been on a device, or if you've had to do some computer work? You know, I kind of always tell my clients, for every hour you're on the computer, I want you outside for 5 minutes. And do you think that there's any benefit to things like earthing and grounding and getting connected to nature that can help be some sort of mitigation for these devices?
I definitely think that's a very wise idea, you know, but I would probably increase the 5 minutes to a little bit more. Okay. I mean, as long as possible, really. Well, and again, you have the foremost expert in the world in California, Clint Ober, who has studied this in many publications. And the earthing issue is extremely interesting. And the only problem here in Sweden is that a long period of the year we have so much snow and so on, so it's a little bit difficult to step around barefooted out in nature. But I think it's a very promising area of research, and I would love to have the resources to do experiments, not only in this particular area, but you have mentioned so many areas within this gigantic question mark of adverse health effects of electromagnetic fields, and I would love to be able to do it, but I don't have the resources, so most of the time I just sit and wait, actually, you know.
Okay, well, you tell me where to start funding your research, and I'll start having everybody send their donations to you so we
Well,
can get it
that
funded.
would be extremely kind, because as with anything, I mean, you cannot buy food without money, you cannot go for a journey without money, and you cannot do research without money. That's just a hard fact,
Sure.
and we need it. It's extremely important. But of course, I'm now retired, so maybe you should better give it to some young scientist somewhere in the world. But it's important, I think, to generate the kind of funding and to have kind of the hands on it, not allow the telecom industry or the radiation protection authorities to decide which kind of research that is allowed and which is not.
Okay.
It's very important that the critical independent scientists, you may say whistleblowers even, that they are allowed as much resources as anyone else. And up till now, that has not been the case.
That's well, I will do my best to get some sort of like something headed your way, or you can tell me what young scientists you know that we need to move towards funding. So,
But this is a problem actually, because I often get that question about the young scientist. And
now there's a
the
call for the young
opposition has
scientists
been
out
so
there.
effective. So people are afraid to enter these kind of areas. It's very difficult to persuade anyone. Actually, what you need to tell a young man or woman is that most likely you will throw your life away, your career, and your future opportunities, but you will make a big footprint for mankind, hopefully.
Yeah. Well,
That's not tempting, is it?
no, it's not tempting, but at the same time, it's like in the same boat I'm in. I'm no scientist, but at the same time, I keep preaching this message out that people need to be aware of what's coming with 5G and just the radiation we're exposed to already. And if I lose followers for it, then so be it. But I'm not going to stop talking about it because I'm passionate, as you are, to tell people this is real and we need to be aware of it. And there's things we can do to mitigate it, so we need to start doing them.
And don't get me wrong, of course, every evening I go down on my knees and pray to God and ask God to make me wrong. I want to be wrong, I want it to be safe. But that would mean that more than 25,000 peer-review-based scientific articles all must be wrong. And that has never, ever happened before. Of course, a few of them may be wrong in the future, but not all of them, So, I mean, I want to be wrong, but the chances for it is pretty slim, I would say,
Well, Dr. Johansson, you've been so generous with your time, and if people want to get in touch with you, and is it okay for them to ask questions, or how would they find you? What should they look for in order to get a hold of you, or just kind of read what you're doing and stuff like that?
Well, maybe start to read, and also to, as you said, check the YouTube. There are some brilliant videos. I haven't done them. Others have. But I'm interviewed and I'm answering questions, and I think, again, that's a very good starting point. And then, of course, there are a lot of material out on the internet, but the problem is that you need to be kind of an expert to really differentiate between what is true and what is not true. And that could be a hard time. And also, it's of course not so easy to organize, but what I see very often is that when I give a lecture at a certain place, town or city or something, that is also a very good starting point. So if you have persons that you can invite to give very good, informed, stable lectures, that's also an excellent way to kind of get the first lessons for free.
Oh, that's awesome. And is there one, if you could pick a website that, like you mentioned, it's hard to find good information when you're on the internet looking around, is there one that you just really recommend as far as electromagnetic field safety?
I don't want to recommend anyone, because if I do, 200s will rightfully be very angry.
Sure.
But there are, of course, a number of very good websites, but I must leave that to each listener to find out for themselves.
Okay.
Or they could contact you and get some further information.
Yeah, and I can maybe put some in the show notes down below of just some good resources that are
Yeah.
generic and really good information.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate it. I'd love to interview you again if time allows sometime down the road.
It's an honor and a joy really to talk to you, because you have done your homework, and I think you should actually have my seat. You should be the retired professor, and I should be doing something else, because you're a real expert.
Well, thank you. I don't consider myself an expert, because an expert means you have to stop learning, and I don't want to stop learning, but at the same time, that's an honor to be said something like that by someone who has a PhD. So,
But the hallmark of a real expert is that he or she knows that they have to learn more.
Okay. Well, I think, we can't stop learning, that's for sure, especially with the coming technology. We got to learn how to protect ourselves.
And you mentioned 5G, and we have already discussions here in Scandinavia about 6 and 7G.
Oh,
so it's going quickly forward,
Oh, my goodness. I had no idea about that. That's crazy.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm already still just shaking about what 5G is going to do. I can't imagine what that's going to do. So... Well, Dr. Johansson, thank you so much, and I appreciate your time today. And yes, we will get together again soon.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Bye-bye.